In this lesson we will start writing tests for functions located inside TimelineItems.ts, and the first such function will be updateTimelineItem. So let's create new test file called TimelineItems.test.ts inside test folder. Here as always I'm going to import an init object from the Vitest library and declare the first testing scenario. It updates TimelineItem, which is supposed to test function called updateTimelineItem. Before writing actual implementation of tests, we'll add all scenarios we're going to test. So the second scenario will be used to test the function with the name resetTimelineItemActivities. So right here I'm gonna duplicate this line and change description of this scenario. It resets TimelineItemActivities. Then there is also this function calculate direct activity seconds. We'll add testing scenario for this function as well. And that's all. Now let's start writing implementation for the first testing scenario. Let's remove this modifier to do and replace it with only. Alright, so before writing implementation, let's see what updateTimelineItem function is doing. It basically accepts TimelineItem object and another object with updated values for fields of TimelineItem object. And then we're basically calling this method assign to assign values of fields object to fields of TimelineItem object. As you may remember, several lessons back, we have already created tests for a similar function, but in that case that function was used to update activity objects. So we can actually copy over the testing scenario for this function. Let's do so right now and paste it into our new test. But of course here we are dealing with TimelineItem objects instead of an activity object. I'm going to rename this constant on TimelineItem. And by the way, TimelineItem objects have such structure. They have 4 fields: our activity ID, activity seconds, and isActive. So now we're going to add proper structure to TimelineItem object right here. But before, let's also change the type of the second constant on TimelineItem. So we are supposed to have 4 fields in this TimelineItem object: field hour, activity ID, activity seconds, and isActive. And for now I'm assigning random values to these properties. And then for the second object, updated fields, I'm going to use same set of properties, but in this case these properties should have different values, since this is the object we're going to use to update the first object. And then down here we're going to call the function updateTimelineItem and accept the result into updateTimelineItem constant. So let's call the function we're testing right here updateTimelineItem, passing TimelineItem object as the first parameter. This is the object we're about to update. And finally, after executing updateTimelineItem, we should expect that TimelineItem object was mutated and now equals to updated fields object. Because updateTimelineItem function not only returns updated object, but also modifies the source object passed as the first parameter into that function. And sure enough, this test is passing. What if we'll try to use to be matcher instead of a to equal? What will happen in this case? The test is failing, because matcher to be compares references of TimelineItem object with updated fields object, and these are 2 different objects, so they have different references. In this case we have to use to equal matcher to compare values of individual properties of these objects. To be extra sure, let's also check what is going to happen if we're gonna pass TimelineItem object as a second argument in here. So in this case we're technically reassigning values of TimelineItem object to the properties of that same object. So basically we're not doing any updates. And sure enough, the test is going to fail in this case, because none of the properties of TimelineItem objects were updated. Let's revert this change, remove modifier only, and in the next lesson we're going to get to writing test implementation to the second testing scenario in this file. Link to the source code of this lesson will be in the video description.